1, 2. It's working. Good. Okay, so we're going to pick up where we left off last week. Actually, it was kind of interesting, and I'm going to get to it in a second. Ralph asked a very good question last week, and Bruce actually said he had the same question. He was sitting over there. We talked about the Nephilim, the fallen ones, the ones that were the product of the consorting of angels with women, DNA modification. And we were talking about the fact that in the Old Testament, when it talks about these in Genesis, it says that, at this time and then thereafter, right? And we talked about Goliath. He was 9 feet tall. His suit of armor, and not even a suit of armor, it was just a chainmail, right? You know what chainmail is. It was 156 pounds. This man was 9 feet tall, and so he himself must have been between 400 and 500 pounds. He must have been huge. And he wasn't some of the huge, the largest Nephilim. So the question is, if all of them got destroyed in the flood, which is exactly what happened, all of humanity except for how many? 8, Noah and his clan. What happened to all of them? Well, everything was destroyed except everything that was in the ark. That means the DNA of, remember we talked about what Enoch said, about how not only were humans sinned against by modifying their DNA, mixing it with DNA of angels, and I'm going to touch this a little more about that, but also of birds, of fish, of plants. Now, that may sound strange to most people, but if you look at what we're doing today, is it impossible to do that today? It's not. We do it all the time now in bioengineering. And they expect more of this to come down the pike. Matter of fact, there is human being version 2.0. Now, a lot of you haven't heard of that because the news doesn't talk about that. But if you look at what DARPA, our defense, what does DARPA stand for? Do you know what it stands for? Yeah, but DARPA is sort of like the Ministry of Defense in England. Okay, something like that. But they do a lot of research, and they've actually put out a statement that says they have 12 months, about a year, about 12 months, to beat the game into making genetic modifications, breakthroughs, and for military, in the military aspect, our enemies will do it. That's how genetic engineering is ready. If you hear of nanotechnology, that's mating micro machines into human beings. You don't think it's already being done? It is. They have implants that do certain things that function as part of a human being today. Little computer chips that can do things. Well, there's a lot to it. I'm not going to get into all of that. If you want to understand more about it, I can bring you to the sources that are not Christian sources. I mean, they're just sources that tell you these things are happening. So what happened? How did they come after the flood? Well, the Nephilim were actually larger in the days in the antediluvian world. They were like some were 30 feet tall. And as a matter of fact, Josephus talks about these huge bones that were found. Right? So, again, you can dispute this if you want. That's fine. You should. But if you're curious, look into it. Look into the history. Look into what was said. Look in all of these ancient things like the Mayan ruins and the pyramids. There is no way that the Egyptians built those pyramids. Those stones are too heavy, and they're too high. If you look at the mass, plus the pyramids were known, especially the Great Pyramid, was known to be built on the earth. There are certain mathematical formulas that are aligned with the stars. It also is built on the Earth's surface where the most mass of the Earth in one place is under the Great Pyramid. So they must have known that's where they needed to build this thing to support the weight, because you notice it hasn't really settled in all these centuries. There's a lot of mathematics behind this, a lot of planning that the Egyptians, no human beings could not have done. There must have been a connection to something out there. Oh, like we heard in Enoch, when he said these angels also taught men the movement of the stars, the mathematics of the earth. Remember we said that last week? This all ties together. This is Satan's tool to not only originally to destroy the line through which Messiah would come. Because remember, there are 4 Gospels, like I've said. I don't know if you've ever heard that before. I mean, you know that there's 4. But why are there 4? Because there are 4 conditions for Messiah. Not 5, not 1, not 3, not 6. There are 4 conditions for that to be met and proved that Messiah must be, and Jesus Christ was the only one to meet all 4, right? The first was the book of Matthew. He had to be king of the Jews. That was Messiah. That was Jesus through the line of David. There's a genealogy there. Just recapping so you're level set on why this is important. So Matthew, Mark. The second is Mark. There's no genealogy in Mark because he also had to be the most humble servant. And Mark has no genealogy because no one cares where a servant comes from. So we have Matthew, Mark, and then we have Luke. Luke was a physician. He had to be absolutely and fully human. And there is a genealogy in Luke that traces him back to Adam. The genealogy in Matthew traces him back to King David. And then we have Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. What was the fourth requirement? Fully God. And there's a genealogy in John. It's very short. It says, in the beginning was the Word, and the Word was God, and the Word was with God. And that Word was, and he became the light of men, and so forth. That's the genealogy. So if you're Satan, you need to at least get rid of one of those things for Messiah, and the first thing you can do is try to pollute the fact that he would be fully human in his DNA. And so he tried. It failed. And again, you're going to have to read my notes. I can't go through the whole Old Testament again. But also, the key point we're going to get into here now is they had erupted again, a lesser strain of the pure Nephilim. And maybe it wasn't only as they went in under women in the way they did pre-flood, but they're still doing genetic engineering. Anybody ever hear of cattle mutilations? UFOs? Anybody ever hear of this stuff? If you haven't heard about it, it's been going on for a long time. It's well documented. It's happening today all over the world. There are farmers who come out and see their cattle, and always their eyes are gone, there's surgical precision in removing their sexual organs, and there is not a single drop of blood in any of these animals ever found for the last 50 years. Why do you think it's all the same? Is it a prank? It's not a prank, is it? It can't be. And how can you possibly drain every drop of blood? I'm telling you, there is not one drop of blood when they find these animals and they bring them to dissect them. Because it's the old blood sacrifice. These beings are making blood sacrifices for themselves. They're demons and they're fallen angels. You see how all of this ties together? They're also noting that there have been alien grays and things. This may sound crazy, but there have been some, and there is pretty much proof that's underground that they've trapped some of them, okay, that Roswell is real. Now, why am I saying all this? Not to entice you to chase demons or anything. What I'm telling you is that this genetic engineering has been going on. It also, to still stem, to destroy humanity, right, because God, we're going to get into that right now, to destroy Messiah, which they couldn't do, but now they've got to destroy him coming back. And it's a chess game. God says, I must do this and I will do this, but he's allowing Satan to also run this course. So it's move, counter move, move, counter move, move, counter move, right? So we're going to see that again as we look back at when the Israelites were to take the promised land and who was there. And we'll talk about Goliath. So it happened afterwards, maybe not in exactly the same mode, but it's happened afterwards and it's happening now. And guess who's helping it happen? Us human beings. We know how to do genetic engineering. I said this in my class before. What was the major thing that happened in the year 2000? Was it 2000? I think they finished it. It was the early 2000s, first couple of years in the new millennium. They mapped the entire human genome. Do you know why they did that? Is it for medical expertise? Oh, that's part of it. That's why they do stem cell research. But it's not just that. If you map the entire human genome, you can actually create, at some point, they believe, you can create life and modify it to be exactly what you want it to be. Say again? DARPA, absolutely. This is all, that's right. DARPA is a black box funding. This is all true. Okay. So let's return to 1 Samuel, and we talked about Goliath. You can turn to, well, just turn to 1 Samuel and stay in, let's see where I'm going to bring you here. Chapter 13. Sorry, no. Chapter 17. Just stay there, and we're going to get to that point. I want to also, well, I'm going to wrap some things up there. And why is this important? Not only to know history, but also to sew up the fact of who Goliath was and who these people were fighting against, who Israel was fighting against. And don't forget, remember, are we all fighting a physical battle on this earth? What's really happening here? Spiritual warfare. You know what that means? That isn't like a private jihad or we're just fighting with spirits trying to, make us sin. It's part of it, but it's much more than that. There are angels battling in the dimensions that we cannot see, that we cannot detect, right? How many dimensions are we in this universe? 4. Maybe that's it. Like there are 4 gospels, there's 4 dimensions. She knows I'm usually in another dimension myself. That's beside the point. Now she puts up with me pretty well because she can't get rid of me. We're all stuck in this dimensions together. But there's absolutely, positively, dimensions that exist outside of these four, which we can't detect. Because if it's true that this universe was created, that means it at one point didn't exist, but something did exist before that, so that's a container for the universe, right? Science is trying to figure all this out, Big Bang, and maybe there's parallel universes and stuff like that. But we know that the universe acts like a clock, and all of the things work together. But if you're not part of this physical universe, then you can do things like we've heard of UFOs do, like you saw with the Temple Mount and that ball coming down, and I know that there are plenty of documents of aircraft that look like anything from big aircraft that are miles long to little flying saucers. They can be going at hundreds of knots of speed and all of a sudden bang a sharp left. Or they can be standing almost still and all of a sudden take off. If you did that in this physical universe, you'd be crushed by inertia, wouldn't you? There's no way you can do that, right? Unless you're not unless you can interlope into this universe and not. And I explained, I'll just go into this real quick here, Mr. and Mrs. Flat, right? If let's say there's a thing called a three-dimensional universe, which only has length and width, no height. There's no such thing as height. You can't imagine that, right? And time. But let's say Mr. and Mrs. Flat live in a two-dimensional universe or three-dimensional universe where we live in four, and I am now, their universe is encapsulated in mine. So this is a universe. This is their universe, right? They can see this way and this way, but they can't see up or down. To them, it doesn't exist. If I take my finger, Mr. Flat is standing here. It's totally flat. And I take my finger, and I'm able, because I'm coming from three dimensions, which this is now contained in, right? This is contained in three dimensions. And I bring my finger in here. What is he going to see? This slice. And he's going to keep seeing slices. And to him, it's going to be some kind of UFO or something that's going to start small, get big, and start small again, right? If I can talk to Mr. Flat, and he's standing here, and I said, there's a point over here. For him, this is a mile. From here to here is a mile for him, let's say. And I say, meet me over there, and he's got a car. And I'm just walking, let's say. He just sees me standing in his two dimensions. But he can only travel this way, right? Or this way. But he can't travel up and down. I can because I'm in three dimensions. So while he's traversing his two dimensions, I can take his two dimensions in my three dimensions and curve them because I'm in three dimensions. I have height. You see what I'm saying? So I can immediately make the 2 points come together and do a hyperspace jump, and I'm already there. While he still has to traverse this distance, I'm already there. He might think I'm a demon or I've done some kind of miracle. All this to say, when we're going to examine right here is you've got to understand that there's a lot more to life than just how we exist. And all of these things that angels are allowed to do, and the fallen ones who are now these demons are allowed to do, you have to take, and I have to take very seriously. It doesn't matter what you learned before. You have to know the truth. And so this is the key. Okay. We talked about the Nephilim, and I read you some things about Enoch. Now, humans, because of sin, are separated from God by at least one layer of abstraction. So when we say the sons of God, we know that he really means angels. And we prove that because he says the same things in Job chapter 1 and verse 6, when we know that God is saying, he's talking to Satan, and he's asking Satan, where have you been? Right? And the angels. And it says, Satan and the sons of God. The same Benai Elohim as it did in Genesis. Let's move on. In Genesis chapter 1, we have the creation account. And I'm going to read you at the creation, the most important feature of everything God created. Just as Genesis, you can just listen. Genesis chapter 1 and 20 to 22. And God said, let the water teem with living creatures, and let birds fly above the earth across the expanse of the sky. So God created the great creatures of the sea, and every living and moving thing with which the waters teem, according to their kind. Now keep that in mind. And every winged bird, according to its kind. And God saw that it was good. God blessed them and said, be fruitful and increase in number and fill the waters in the sea and let the birds increase on the earth. In the same way, human beings are created, and we're only allowed to procreate after our kind, right? Why? First of all, what does it say? If something can only procreate after its kind, immediately you know that evolution cannot be possible, right? There's mutations within a species. That's fine. That's why there's, we're all different in this room, but we're still human beings. There are different breeds of dogs, but they're all still dogs. Cats, birds, No matter, there's differences in the species, but the species never cross. Why is that? Because it seems very strongly, and I'm going to talk to you about this, there is a certain, when God creates a physiology, he creates a certain spirit for that physiology. Like, you ever notice a cow never acts like a cat? Doesn't lick itself and, try to scratch a scratching post. Human beings don't act like dogs unless, of course, they're under hypnosis. That's another story. A bird does not act like a sheep. Why? Because every animal, every being that God creates is created with a certain spirit. And that goes for the spirit in man. And I'm going to tell you this in Genesis chapter 1, and now moving forward to verse 26. It says, "Then God said, let us make man in our image." By the way, if there's one God, why does he say our? Trinity. Because he's Trinity. We don't understand that. But we know that there are three, but they are so tightly integrated that they act as one. And so they're three in one, and it's a triune God. That's the best we can do in not understanding how God is in the eternal realm, which is different than our physical universe. But that's the best we can do. But we know it's true because he tells us. So he says, let's make man in our image, in our likeness, and let them rule over the fish of the sea and the birds of the air, over the livestock, over all the earth, and over all the creatures that move along the ground. So that tells you something right there. Are we different than the birds? Do we have a different capability than the fish? We are. We do. That's why there are a lot of people, and I've talked to atheists who believe that dolphins are so smart and they believe in evolution, so monkeys and all these things are just evolving. They're not as smart as we are yet, but they think it's so cute because a dolphin can play tricks and a dog can... That's not intelligence. There's no art. There's no science. There's no real love. There's no relationships other than the instincts God puts into each animal according to its kind. Human beings, would you say, are very different? Have you ever seen a dog that became an architect? No. How about DNA modification? Ever seen a cat do biotechnology or no biology? They don't even know that they were once not existing, and they don't even know they're going to die. But you and I can have that. Also, God in our hearts put eternity. We have a concept of eternity, which is, by the way, not just a real long span of time. Time is a physical construct, and time is slowing down, by the way, with the universe. It's winding down. So eternity has nothing to do with time. Time did not exist before this universe was created. That's a scientific fact. If you want to ask me more questions about it, I'll be glad to answer you. So he says in verse 27, so God created man in his own image. In the image of God, he created him. And then he says, male and female. Now in Job, if you're familiar with the book of Job, and if you're not, you really should be. As a matter of fact, one of the first books I tell new Christians to look at, although I want them to see the New Testament first. But it gives a relationship. It really shows how God operates and what he and how he works. But Job, in this, I just want to read you Job chapter 32 and verse 8. But it is the spirit in a man, the breath of the Almighty, what? That gives him understanding. Do you get what that's saying? The spirit in man is the only thing that gives a man or a woman, a human being, the ability to understand anything. Animals don't understand really anything, do they? Do they understand this? Are they made to understand the sciences or anything? No. It's human beings. So it says a spirit in a man, the breath of the Almighty, or not just the physical life, but the spirit in that life, in that human being, that gives him understanding. Nephilim, looking at this, Nephilim were created using tools that God already created. And so they have minds like human beings because there's human DNA in them. They also have attributes that are angelic too, and we'll talk more about that some other time. But one thing that they don't have is a spirit that God created for them because they are not specific creations by God. Does that make sense? So that's why, and these fallen ones, and you'll see the spirit of the dead, these offspring of the angels and human beings, there's no salvation for them. Scripture says it very plainly. There's no salvation for them. And we might say, oh, that's awful because they were born as they look like human beings. They were big and they had these attributes, but they look like human beings. They were hybrids. There is no salvation for any being but what? Human beings. Can we agree on that? The Catholic Church is looking for aliens. I read those articles to you. And they want to baptize E.T. I read that article to you. Do they read Scripture? Do they know in the Vatican what they're talking about? What they're doing? This is why I wanted to bring all these things to you so we can sew it up together as fact. Others consider Nephilim, in contrast, to be the offspring of human descendants from Seth. And probably some of you have heard that before, right? We're going to talk about that right now. And the women were from Cain. So, the good line melding with the bad line created these evil characters. Well, first of all, if that's the case, there's still human men marrying and mating with human women. They wouldn't have created ungodly giants. So that's out. And I'm going to read you something because it's just interesting here. In context, this is a Tim LaHaye prophecy study Bible. You've probably heard of Tim LaHaye, okay? Anybody, I remember I mentioned to you Chuck Missler. And so I don't really use this Bible that much. I use it to round out some of the things I need to know when I'm doing my study. But it just so happened, just a coincidence, quote unquote, I took a look at it this morning because I wanted to look something up. And usually I use an electronic Bible on my computer, so I don't really use this that much. Well, guess what happened? I'm looking at 1 Samuel, and in the context of Goliath, there's a whole article here by Chuck Missler about fallen angels. And I read it and I said, I've got to read this to everybody because it sums up what we're talking about. This is the article. Fallen angels are first introduced in Genesis chapter 6, 1 through 4. In the Old Testament, the term sons of God is exclusively used of angels, and it also references what I was talking about in Job. Jesus implies the same in Luke chapter 20 and verse 36. The unnatural offspring resulting from their consorting with human wives, the daughters of Adam, or the daughters of mankind, Adam, are called Nephilim, or the fallen ones. In Hebrew, Nephal is to fall. It means to fall. So it was understood by many ancient Jewish scholars, the translators of the Septuagint, which is the early Greek translation, if you've heard of that, and the early church, like I told you, the early church fathers believed this, what I'm telling you. None of this Seth and all of these other explanations were in force until the 5th century. So there's something to this. The translation in the Greek actually is giant. We see like there were giants in those days, or it says giants in our translations. The actual Greek is gigantes, which actually means earthborn. These earthborn freaks, if you will. That's what it means. The unnatural offspring was apparently a satanic plot to corrupt the human genealogy in an attempt to preclude redemptive kinsman redeemer, the Messiah, who descended from the line of Seth. This was one reason behind the flood. Noah was still distinctive in having an unblemished genealogy or unblemished DNA. Does that make sense? That's what we're talking about. Similar events apparently may have occurred after the flood, giving rise to the Nephilim, also called the Rephaim, Emims, and Horims, and other things in Scripture, encountered by Israel in the land of Canaan throughout the Old Testament, like Goliath, right? Like when they went into the Promised Land. And this also goes into the alternative story about the Seth, business line of Seth, and it goes in it. But I want to read this to you. Okay. So there's more to it. You can read my notes. Okay, but I just want to read you 2 Peter, chapter 2 and verse 4. This is talking about these angels who sinned, who were locked away, these 200 or so that started this. For if God did not spare angels when they sinned, but sent, already past tense, sent them to hell, putting them into gloomy dungeons, the abyss, and held for judgment. Would you say Satan is held for judgment right now? He's not. His fallen angels, most of them held for judgment right now? They're not. They're roaming around with these demons who are the disembodied Nephilim. If he did not spare the ancient world when he brought the flood on its ungodly people, but protected Noah, a preacher of righteousness, and 7 others, then he's talking about, in reference to the flood, that these angels who did this most abhorrent thing have been locked down, but not all of them because it's happening now, right? He's not locking them down again, because this is time. But the first 200 that I mentioned to you last week, who actually created the first Nephilim through women, were done. Back in Deuteronomy, there's a king called King Og. Anybody ever hear King Og? I've mentioned him in this class. Let me read to you about King Og very quickly. Deuteronomy chapter 3 and verses 8 through 11. So at that time, we took from these 2 kings, the Amorites, the territory east of the Jordan, from the Arnon Gorge as far as Mount Hermon. Ooh, we talked about Mount Hermon last week as the place where these angels came down and did their first deed. We took all the towns on the plateau and all of Gilead and all Bashan as far as Selkah and Edrei, towns of Og's kingdom in Bashan. Only Og, king of Bashan, was left of the remnant of the Rephaites, or the Rephaim, which are the same thing as the Nephilim. So Scripture is telling us that this is not a normal human being. It's telling us right here. And it says, right after it tells us who he's from and what he is. His bed was made of iron and was more than 13 feet long and 6 feet wide. This was a single bed for him. It is still in Rabbah of the Ammonites. So they still had this bed. And it was made of iron. If his bed was 13 feet long, how tall must have this man have been? How tall was Goliath? We know he was 9 feet tall. That's what it says. You see? And making it clear that this man was one of these hybrids that came after. He wasn't as tall and big as the original ones, but he was there. Remember the land of Canaan? All right? I'm going to read you something here. Numbers 13, 17 through 33. When Moses sent them to explore Canaan, he said, go up through the Negev, and he tells them to do. He wants to know what kind of soil is there and if it's fertile and all that stuff. So he sends the spies out there. In verse 23, when they reached the valley of Eshcol, they cut off a branch bearing a single cluster of grapes. A single cluster of grapes. 2 of them carried it on a pole between them. Well, along with a single cluster of grapes, and it took 2 men to carry it. Didn't they sin against fruit and vegetables? They had to have big food to feed these big beings. Okay? Let's go back. And by the way, later in Numbers, it says here in Numbers chapter 13 and 33, when they're reporting the spies who came and had a bad report, it said, we saw the Nephilim there. The descendants of Anak came from the Nephilim. So they saw these people there. We seemed, how big were these people? Well, they were more than 9 feet tall because it said, we seemed like grasshoppers in our own eyes, and we looked the same to them. These must have been huge, huge, if we as human beings look like grasshoppers in their sights. So now we understand better who, or rather what, Goliath was part of. He wasn't as big as the original Nephilim, but neither was King Og. But they were big, they were tall, and these were the champions, the men of renown of the old days, like we talked about. Let's now go into 1 Samuel chapter 17 and verse 12. So we're talking about, I'm going to skip down a little bit, David here, and his first real encounter is with whom? Goliath. Everybody knows the story. Let me see. I want to skip some things here because we only have a few minutes left here. In verse 24, chapter 17. When the Israelites saw the man, Goliath, they all ran from him in great fear. Now the Israelites had been saying, do you see how this man keeps coming out? He comes out to defy Israel. The king will give great wealth to the man who kills him. Even the king, Saul, was scared of him. He had his whole army with him, and yet they were scared of him more than the whole army that was behind him. I'm going to skip the rest of this. You can read it in my notes. It goes to the whole point of David getting 5 smooth stones, right? And finally killing Goliath by getting one right in the forehead. You know the story. But you also know that David, and here's where we're going to start wrapping up here. Before David was able to use the slingshot, remember what King Saul did to him? You can read it in scripture in my notes. I'm not going to go through the text here. Saul said, all right, David, we'll let you go. Now, David's a little guy, right? Little ruddy guy. But he said to him, wear my suit of armor. Remember that in scripture? Wear my suit of armor. Because you need something to go up against this guy. And we're coming to a point, a very, very prominent point that God makes to us. So just hang in there for a second. And David tries to put it on, and he's swimming in it. Can you imagine this little guy in his big, heavy suit of armor that was heavy for Saul, and he's a little young man who can barely put this on. He takes it off. He says, I can't use this. It's too big. It's too bulky. I will not be able to move, right? So he takes it off. So when David approaches him, let's move down to chapter 17 and verse 48 in 1 Samuel. As the Philistine moved closer to attack him, Goliath, David ran quickly toward the battle line to meet him. Reaching into his bag and taking out a stone, he slung it and struck the Philistine on the forehead. The stone sunk into his forehead, and he fell face down to the ground. That sounds like supernatural intervention for a stone to be able to do that, to sink into this big man. Imagine how thick his skull must be if he was that big. Some people say I have a thick skull too. She didn't hear that. She's not looking at me. Never mind. Verse 50. Now listen to this, and this is the point I want to make. So David triumphed over the Philistine with a sling and a stone. Listen to this. Without a sword in his hand, struck down the Philistine and killed him. Why is Scripture making that point? Well, we know later on, I'm going to read this in a second, about putting on the whole armor of God. Isn't that what we're told in the book of Ephesians? This is pointing to that. Number one, it is God who is our shield. We should never provide our own armor, as it will not fit us. That makes sense? Don't provide for yourself protection And if you do, it's only because, what I'm saying is normally you have to protect yourself, but I mean, don't rely on your own ways of keeping your body safe and your family safe, and especially as the world darkens, because you're going to lose. There's no way we're going to survive this world the way it's going. It's not going to happen. Number 2, it is God who fights the battles. We should not attempt to raise our own sword. God is the one who fights the battles with his word. And you drawing closer to God will make you ready to be able to use what he gives you to fight the battles, whatever they are. Number 3, while we are in human form, we will always be smaller than our enemy. So we can never fight him on his or our terms. We can't do that. We are not. Can you fight Satan? Can you fight influences? You can't do that. The battle is the Lord's, which is like point 2. Point 4, however, always be about preparing yourself to master the art of war as David did during his time as a shepherd. Always be ready as preparing yourself for war, even though the battle is the Lord's. Because David said, when he was talking to Saul about doing this, he said, I have fought a lion and a bear, and I ripped them both apart. Remember that says that in Scripture. He's already been battle tested and hardened and knows the way of battle. So always be prepared. Master the art of war, and all of this in context, and we'll wrap up here in Ephesians chapter 6, verses 11 to 13. Put on the full armor of God so that you can take your stand against the devil's schemes. You have to take a stand. You just can't sit back and do nothing, but you can't fight the battle yourself, right? So taking the stand means being prepared to understand how to take that stand when the time comes. That takes work. It takes patience. It takes understanding God. It takes understanding his word and being close to him. So you can always be ready for the battle, whatever the battle's going to be. For our struggle is not against flesh and blood, but against the rulers. There's a hierarchy here, a government. The rulers, against the authorities, against the powers of this dark world, which is the governments that are led, all of the people that are in high places in our governments around the world are used as pawns by Satan through his authorities above them. Against the powers of this dark world and against the spiritual forces of the evil in the heavenly realms. Those are the demons and the lower ones who are in the heavenly realms around us really doing more of the low-level dirty work. That's what it's saying here. There is a hierarchy. Just like in God's government, there's a hierarchy, right? For us, it's God. And then if you're married, it's the husband, and then the wife, and then the children. That's the hierarchy. That's why it says, children, obey your parents. Women, be submissive to your own husband, submit to your own husband, and husbands, love your wives as Christ loved the church, under God, right? That's the point. Now, women don't believe that. Some children don't believe that. It doesn't matter what anybody believes. It matters what the truth is, and if we choose to follow it or not. And people always walk around the truth. But the point is that that's the government. Well, there's a government in Satan's realm too. Therefore, put on the full armor that you find, that someone gives you. No. Put on the full armor of God, so that when, not if, but when the day of evil comes, you will be able to stand your ground. And after you have done everything, which means to prepare, to stand. That's the whole point. So all of this gave David some public recognition as the deliverer of Israel. We're going to finish this up next week. And then we're going to start the second book of Samuel. We're going to wrap up. Saul is actually going to now die. Not a very nice death either. And because God already predicted it. He already said to Saul, there is no use for you now. You have done so many things wrong. And you have usurped my authority. Next week we're going to talk about the final thing he does, which is the final straw. He actually consults a witch. The witch of Endor. Anybody ever see the old Bewitched series from the 60s? What was Samantha's mother's name? Endora. You think that these people who created these shows don't know Scripture? There's a hierarchy, and all of those people in the media are in that hierarchy too, because Satan is the prince of the power of the air. So we're going to talk about that next week. Please study the notes and email me if you have any questions. I hope you enjoyed being here today. I know it's a lot, especially if you haven't been here.